You told someone too much. Not once as a mistake, but as a habit. You handed them the blueprint of your interior architecture, the fracture lines, the soft places beneath the marble. And somewhere in the silence that followed, you felt it. The slow, cold recognition that you had made yourself smaller by trying to be seen. This is not a rare experience. It is an epidemic with no name on the cultural diagnosis sheet. The modern pressure to disclose, to perform openness, to weaponize vulnerability as a social currency, has convinced an entire generation that the path to connection is total transparency. Confess your fears in the group chat, post the breakdown. Narrate the wound while it is still bleeding. The algorithm rewards exposure. The culture applauds it. And you, standing in the ruins of your own fortress, wonder why you feel less powerful after every confession, not more. You were never taught that exposure and intimacy are not the same thing. One is architecture, the other is demolition. The Stoics understood something that the modern mind has almost entirely forgotten. Marcus Aurelius did not write his meditations for public consumption. He wrote them in private, iron pressed against stone, a sovereign speaking only to himself. The most powerful philosophical mind of the ancient world kept his interior life sealed. Not because he was ashamed, because he understood that the mind is a fortress, and a fortress with open gates is not a fortress. It is a ruin waiting to be named. The warrior in ancient tradition was not celebrated for his emotional disclosure. He was forged in silence. The blade does not announce its sharpness. It demonstrates it. There is a discipline in withholding, not the discipline of repression, but the discipline of sovereignty. The sovereign does not explain himself to the crowd, he acts, the crowd interprets. And in that gap between action and interpretation, his power lives. Epictetus, a man who began his life in chains, understood that the only unbreakable fortress is the interior one. He did not seek to be understood by his captors, he sought to be impenetrable to them. His philosophy was not built on sharing his suffering. It was built on refusing to let his suffering be owned by anyone but himself. That is not coldness, that is the highest form of self-possession. Here is where the modern mind fractures against ancient stone. You have been told that being understood is the goal. That if you explain yourself fully, your history, your damage, your reasoning, your fear, you will finally be safe. Finally accepted, finally free, but consider what total transparency actually produces. Every detail you volunteer about yourself is a stone removed from your fortress wall. Every confession made to the wrong ear becomes a blade held by someone else's hand. Every fracture you illuminate for an audience becomes a map they can use, not to help you, but to navigate around your defenses. The paradox is this: the more you reveal in the pursuit of being understood, the less you are. Not because vulnerability is weakness in its raw form, the kintsugi tradition proves that fracture can become gold. But because there is a profound difference between integrating your wounds privately and displaying them publicly for the comfort of others. One is transformation, the other is performance. And performance, no matter how sincere it feels in the moment, always costs the performer more than the audience. The disciplined mind does not perform its healing. It completes it in the shadow, in the silence, in the interior fire that no one else is permitted to witness. What emerges on the other side is not a man who has been understood. It is a man who no longer requires understanding to stand. This is part one. The diagnosis has been made, The fracture has been named. What remains is the forging. Forging begins here. Not with comfort, not with permission, with iron. There are two pillars that hold the architecture of the sovereign interior. Remove either one and the structure does not lean. It collapses entirely. The ancient mind understood this, with a clarity that the modern age has traded for applause. The first pillar is selective silence. The second is strategic opacity. They are not the same discipline, though the weak often confuse them. One governs what you choose not to say. The other governs how much of yourself you permit to be read. Selective silence is not the silence of the defeated. It is not the silence of the man who has nothing to say. It is the deliberate withholding of a blade that has not yet found its moment. The warrior does not announce his strategy. The sovereign does not explain his reasoning to those who will use the explanation as a crowbar. Silence chosen consciously is not absence. It is presence compressed into a form that cannot be diluted. Every word you do not speak remains yours. Every confession you withhold stays inside the fortress where it belongs, where it can be refined, not ransacked. The modern architecture of social life is built to extract this silence from you. The group demands your opinion. The relationship demands your history. The platform demands your wound. And the extraction is dressed as intimacy, as trust, as the proof that you are open, healed, evolved. But the disciplined mind recognizes the mechanism beneath the invitation. It is not intimacy they are offering, it is access, and access once granted cannot be revoked. The second pillar, strategic opacity, operates at a deeper level. It is not merely about what you say. It is about the image you permit others to construct of you. The sovereign understands that every person who encounters him is building a model of who he is, a map drawn from the details he provides. The disciplined man controls the cartography. He does not falsify, he curates. He allows the shadow of his architecture to be seen, without illuminating the interior chambers. The blade is sheathed, but its weight is known. The fortress is present, but its layout remains uncharted. This is not deception. Deception requires a lie. Strategic opacity requires only restraint, the refusal to hand a stranger the key to a room they have not earned. Consider two men, same room, same pressure. The first is the weak. He has been taught that openness is virtue, that the measure of a man's depth is how much of himself he will pour into the silence between conversations. A colleague challenges his decision in front of others. He explains, he justifies. He traces the reasoning back to its origin, back to the fear that produced it, back to the wound that made him cautious. He believes this transparency will generate understanding. What it generates is a map. His colleague now knows where the fracture lines run. The explanation that was meant to close the distance has handed someone else the architecture of his interior. The room has not warmed, it has simply changed hands. The second is the sovereign. The same challenge arrives. He does not fill the silence with justification. He does not illuminate his reasoning or trace his fear back to its source for an audience that did not earn the knowledge. He speaks precisely what is necessary. Not one stone more is removed from the wall. His response is not cold, it is complete. It leaves no gap for interpretation, because it offers no excess material to interpret. The room does not know what to do with a man who cannot be mapped. And that uncertainty, that irreducible opacity, is the source of his gravity. Not his credentials, not his history, his silence. The difference between these two men is not intelligence. It is not even confidence. It is architecture. One man has been convinced that his interior is a gift to be given freely. The other understands that the interior is a forge, and the forge does not open its doors to spectators. The fracture lines of the weak become weapons in other hands. The sealed chambers of the sovereign remain gold that no one else can spend. Now the fact stated without softening. When you dismantle the first pillar, when selective silence is abandoned for the performance of openness, you do not become more connected. You become more legible, and a legible man is a manageable man. He can be anticipated. He can be navigated around. He can be used with precision because the user holds the map he handed them freely. The relationships built on this foundation are not intimacy. They are dependency dressed in the language of closeness. You become necessary to others not because of your strength, but because of your exposed fracture lines, because they know exactly where to press to produce the response they need. When the second pillar falls, when strategic opacity dissolves into the compulsion to be fully known, the self does not expand. It disperses. The man who can be entirely read by the room is a man who no longer belongs to himself. His interior has been distributed among the interpretations of others. He wakes each morning and assembles his identity from the reflections other people have handed back to him. The mirror is no longer his own. It is a committee. This is the cost, not metaphorical. Architectural. A fortress with no sealed chambers is not a fortress. It is a corridor, and corridors exist to be passed through, not to be inhabited, not to be respected, not to be feared. The man who has made himself entirely transparent has made himself entirely traversable. He becomes the path others walk on the way to something more formidable. The forging is not finished, but the stone has been named. The fire has been identified. What remains is the final discipline, the one that transforms the sealed interior from a defensive posture into an offensive force. That is where the gold is poured. The sealed interior is not the destination, it is the condition. A fortress that only defends is a fortress that waits to be starved. The sovereign does not build walls merely to hide behind them. He builds them so that what emerges from within them carries weight, undiluted, uncompromised, impossible to dismiss. The discipline of withholding is not the end of the architecture. It is the foundation upon which something formidable is constructed. The ancient warrior did not seal himself in silence because silence was comfortable. He sealed himself because the fire inside required oxygen that the crowd would consume if given access. Every word not spoken to the wrong ear was fuel redirected inward. Every fracture not displayed was gold still in the forge. The sealed interior is not a tomb, it is a furnace. And what a furnace produces, when left undisturbed long enough, is not warmth. It is force. This is the final discipline, not the discipline of restraint. The discipline of emergence, knowing when the blade leaves the sheath and ensuring that when it does, it cannot be ignored. The philosophy has been laid in stone. Now the stone becomes iron. Here is the framework, not a suggestion, not a practice, not an invitation. A protocol, 3 commands for the man who has decided that his interior belongs to him. First, the audit of access before you speak, before you disclose. Before you hand another person a detail of your interior architecture. Ask one question only. Has this person earned the room, not whether they are kind? Not whether they seem safe, not whether the silence feels uncomfortable. Whether they have demonstrated, through sustained action over time, that what you place in their hands will not become a blade. If the answer is uncertain, the answer is no. The stone does not move. The man who makes access difficult to earn does not become isolated, he becomes selective. And selectivity is the architecture of respect. Second, the discipline of incompleteness, when pressure mounts to explain yourself fully, to justify your reasoning, to trace your decision back to its wound, for an audience that demands transparency. Give them the shadow of the answer, not the interior. Speak what is necessary. Stop before the fracture lines are illuminated. The sovereign does not leave the room empty-handed. He leaves the room with something withheld. And that withheld weight is felt long after the conversation ends. A man who never fully explains himself cannot be fully predicted. A man who cannot be predicted cannot be managed. The asymmetry is absolute. Incompleteness in the right hands is more powerful than full disclosure in any hands. Third, the forged response emotion is not the enemy, unrefined emotion is. The disciplined mind does not suppress what it feels, it processes it in the interior fire before it reaches the surface. When the challenge comes, when the provocation arrives dressed as conversation, when the room expects the fracture to show, the sovereign responds from the gold, not from the wound. He has already sat with the feeling in silence. He has already pressed it against stone and let the heat work on it. What the room receives is not a reaction, it is a position. And a position, unlike a reaction, cannot be used against the man who holds it. The blade that has been tempered does not shatter on impact. It cuts clean and withdraws without apology. You are not a finished structure. You are unfinished marble, and that is not a flaw in your condition. It is the condition of the formidable. Marble does not apologize for its weight. It does not explain its density to the hands that cannot lift it. It exists with a completeness that requires no external validation, no audience, no applause. The fractures in you are not evidence of ruin. They are the lines where gold can be poured, but only if you stop letting others pour their interpretations into them first. The man who hands his wounds to the crowd does not receive healing in return. He receives commentary, and commentary is the slowest form of erosion there is. Seal the interior, tend the fire. Let what emerges from the forge speak in the only language that cannot be argued with, the language of presence, of gravity, of a man who has become so complete within himself that the room adjusts to him. Not the other way around. That is not arrogance, that is the final product of the discipline. The marble finished, the gold set. The fortress, inhabited by someone who no longer needs to be understood because he has already understood himself. The cost of being understood is this. You pay it with yourself. Piece by piece, stone by stone, confession by confession. Until the fortress is a corridor and the corridor is empty, and the man who once stood at the center of his own architecture is now a reflection assembled from other people's readings of him. The alternative is not loneliness, it is sovereignty. It is the silence that precedes the blade. It is the shadow that confirms the fortress is still standing. It is the gold inside the fracture that no one else was permitted to pour. The Stoic did not seek to be remembered for what he revealed. He sought to be remembered for what he built. Build accordingly. Only those who refuse comfort will understand what comes next. Subscribe to Marble and Mind.